Okay, we'll be in Exodus chapter 5. But before we get there, by way of background, the opening verse of Exodus, now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. That takes us back to what is recorded in the closing chapters of Genesis, where we read of Jacob and his family settling in the land of Egypt. We're told in Exodus 12, verse 40, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. 430 years. Acts 7, verse 6, we read that they were treated evil for 400 years. So they were there for 430 years, and 400 of those years they were in bondage. So you have 10 years, 10 generations of bondage. 10 generations of bondage. In Exodus 3, Moses is on the backside of the desert. God appears unto him in a miraculous manner. And notice what God says to him, verse 7 and verse 8. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land unto a good land, a large land flowing with milk and honey. And then in verse 10, Come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of bondage. Moses would proceed to stress what he saw as potential problems to God's plan. Man is so ignorant where he sees potential problems in God's plan. That's what Moses did. It's what God's people still do. And God further instructs him. Moses in chapter 4 continues to argue with God. And in each argument, God would direct Moses' attention to himself. The lesson, God was the answer to every scenario and potential problem. Moses would proceed to tell God that he was not able to perform the task that God was giving him, using his slowness of speech as a reason. And then in verses 11 and 12 of chapter 4, you have God's response. And in verse 13, Moses pleads with God that he would send someone with him. God informs Moses that he would send his brother Aaron as a spokesman. Moses and Aaron then would gather the children of Israel, told them that God was going to deliver them from Egyptian bondage. And we read in verse 31 of chapter 4, and the people believed. And the people believed. And that brings us to our text, chapter 5, verse 1. And afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. And from here through chapter 14, you have the historical record of how God brought Israel out from the heavy hand of Pharaoh and out of Egyptian bondage. And of course, the deliverance of Israel from Egypt is a type of our redemption by Christ. But in our text, Moses and Aaron would say to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." That. What follows is the reason they were to be set free, that they may hold a feast unto me, that they may unto me hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. They were to be set free to do something unto me, is what God says. Set free to move in the direction of God. Unto me. Unto is a preposition that indicates direction. So they were to be set free to move in the direction of God. Now Moses and Aaron would appear several times before Pharaoh. Chapter 7, verse 16, he says, "Let my people go that they may serve me." Chapter 8, verse 1, "Let my people go that they may serve me." Verse 20, "Let my people go that they may serve me." Chapter 9, verse 15, "Let my people go that they may serve me." Chapter 10, verse 3, "Let my people go that they may serve me." God wasn't going to liberate them so that they would be free to wander, free to do their own thing. He was going to liberate them so that they could worship and serve Him. That was the reason. And for us that are saved, God did not save our soul for you and I to wander, do our own thing, nor did He save our soul for us to go back in the same mess again, but that we would worship and serve Him with our life. And that's our subject, set free to worship and to serve God. We have been saved to worship and to serve God. And if we're not doing that, then we're unfaithful. You call it whatever you like. We're unfaithful if we're not doing that. For you and I that have been miraculously saved by the Lord, something wonderful, something marvelous, something spectacular has taken place. We have been rescued. We have been released. We have been recovered from the depths of sin. We were estranged from God, living our lives under the dominion of Satan, living in the realm and under the power of darkness. We were deceived. We were ignorant. We were blind. We were hardened against God. We were criminals against God. We were striving against God, living in absolute defiance of God. We were unrighteous. We were ungodly. We were unprofitable. We were bankrupt. We were fleeing from God. We were helplessly trapped under the weight of sin. We were stuck in the contamination of sin, destruction of sin. Stuck in the loss that sin brings, stuck in the misery that sin brings. And we were so securely held that we could not possibly escape. That was our condition. And the Lord came where we were. And He broke the holding and binding power of sin. And He raised us up from a spiritual grave. Raised us up out of the depths of our unrighteousness and our wickedness and our enmity and our spiritual bankruptcy and our condemnation. He raised us out of the depths of the filth and the vileness of our unsaved condition. delivering and freeing us from the curse of the law, it was the Lord that imparted life to our soul. It was the Lord that broke the awful control and the chains and shackles of sin. It was the Lord that rescued us from the mire of sin. We have been saved. We have been saved by the Lord. We have been taken up out of the depths of sin, taken into the blessings of salvation. We are living miracles of God, having passed from death unto life, born from above, made anew, redeemed, citizens of heaven, more than conquerors through Him, accepted by God, blessed by God, bought by God, a beneficiary of the person and work of Jesus Christ, called of God, delivered and emancipated by God, fixed, healed, and helped by God, kept and loved by God. And all of this was done so that we could worship and serve Him. That's why it was done. And oh, how we ought to love Him. And oh, how we ought to be absorbed and taken up with the one who saved our souls. And oh, how we ought to honor Him and exalt Him and bow to Him and sing to Him and worship Him and live for Him without any reservation whatsoever. For this reason we were saved. Again, the Lord did not save our soul so that we could wander and do as we please in our lives and just have a good time. He did not save our souls that we would become entangled again in the affairs of life. He saved us so that we would worship Him and live wholeheartedly for Him. And if we're not doing that, we're unfaithful. So here we are, saved by the Lord, living miracles of the Lord. And now our lives are to be an expression of love, devotion, adoration, and thanksgiving to Him. Saved by the Lord, not to live for self, but to live for Him. Notice again in our text, let my people go, that they, the ones released, let my people go, the ones saved, that they may hold a feast unto me. Set free to live in the direction of and for God. It is saved so that life could be clearly and distinctly all about Him. Saved so that He would be the focal point of our lives. That He would be the priority and the purpose of our lives. Saved so that our lives would be a monument of love to Him. So saved so that our lives would be lives of belief in Him. Separated unto Him. Committed to Him. Close to Him. Obedience to Him. Fellowship with Him. Saved so that our lives could be lives of living, vibrant, functioning relationship with God. But if these people were to serve God and worship God, they must be set free. So that brings us to the necessity of breaking loose from Pharaohs. Egypt, of course, all through the Old Testament, is a picture of the world system, which is carnal. It's a carnal method to living. It is a carnal approach to life. It is a way of life that worships the creature more than the Creator. If you were to tell God's people that you worship the creature more than you do the Creator, almost all of them would deny it, but it's so. Man worships the creature and not the Creator. And it is so of those who profess to be God's people. Egypt is a way of life that places its priorities, its interests, its treasures in the creature or in the carnal. A way of life that is driven and governed by self-desires, self-impulses, earthly mindedness. A way of life that centers around and lived in response to self. It is a way of life that strives after admiration and applause, strives after the honors of the world. A way of life lived under and shaped by the power and the influence and the effect and the sway of the temporary. It is a way of life away from God. And this way of life shapes the judgment and shapes the understanding of an individual. And therefore, the thinking, the ideas, the philosophies, the values, the goals, the attitudes of this system are all detrimental to the life that we're called to live. They're all crippling to a life of worship and serving God. And all through the Scriptures, we read of those in some type of physical imprisonment, especially in the Old Testament. Terrible imprisonments. There's the mention of dungeons and pits and mire and chains and shackles, bars of iron. But as terrible and painful as those physical imprisonments were, there are spiritual imprisonments, spiritual chains and shackles, far, far more devastating to the child of God than these physical imprisonments. We've all seen, I'm sure, you see pictures of the tunnels of Hamas where people are being held. Terrible places. Terrible. But there are spiritual imprisonments far worse. Far more extensive than these physical places of imprisonments. There are spiritual pits that are more desolate, that are more gloomy and miserable than these physical places of imprisonment. There are spiritual confinements that are darker than these places of physical confinement. They are darker. The chains and the shackles more confining than these places of physical imprisonments. There are spiritual entrapments that are more inescapable than these physical places of imprisonment. There are spiritual prisons more guarded than these physical places. There are spiritual chains and shackles that are heavier and tighter and more restrictive than the chains of these physical places of imprisonment. There are spiritual captivities. There are spiritual enclosures that have iron gates, more solid, more unyielding, more indestructible than the gates of these physical places of imprisonment. These prisons are dark. They're dingy. They're miserable places. Places of desolation and torture. Places of defeat and deprivation. These spiritual prisons will keep you from worshiping and serving the one who saved our soul. For decades I've been hearing excuses for unfaithfulness. Just be honest. I'm in prison. I can't worship. I'm in prison. I can't serve God. I'm in prison. I'm imprisoned. That's the truth. But we've been set free to worship and to serve God. These spiritual prisons will keep us from worshiping and serving the one who saved our soul. Again, 10 generations, 30 years, unbound, 400 years, bound. What does that tell you? Once you become bound in Egypt, it's not easy to be freed. It's not easy. Jacob and his family went to Egypt for a better life. 30 years. Life was pretty good. 400 years in bondage. Bound in Egypt's way of life for 10 generations. What that tells us is once you become bound in Egypt, it can be generational. It can be generational. I've now pastored long enough to see that, where there's been a couple generations, just like mom and dad. Mom and dad's passed, but guess what? They're still living right through their children. Children doing the same things. It's generational. So there are people today saved by grace, and they can't. They won't either, but they can't worship and serve God with their lives. They cannot do what they were saved to do. Because they're bound. They're shackled. They're held secure in bondage. There's some Pharaoh. Pharaoh comes in many forms. That seeks to keep the child of God in bondage. Why? So that they cannot worship God. So that they cannot serve God with their lives. Pharaoh is an enemy to your soul. And they need to be identified. There are many Pharaohs that strive to keep us from a functional relationship with the Lord. Pharaoh may be family. Pharaoh doesn't have to be sin. Pharaoh may be family. Pharaoh may be friends. Pharaoh may be responsibilities. Pharaoh may be plans. Pharaoh may be pursuits. Pharaoh may be careers. On and on we could go. Pharaoh may be earthly cares. Again, not necessarily sinful, just burdens that you have can become a Pharaoh. There's the Pharaoh of pride. There's the Pharaoh of hypocrisy. Generations and generations of hypocrisy. The Pharaohs of religion. Pharaohs of a mere formality. There are the Pharaohs of jealousy. Now, how many people can't serve God because they're jealous all the time? There are the Pharaohs of anger. There's people that are just mad all the time. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you say or don't say. They're going to be mad. Why is that? They're in bondage. The Pharaoh of anger. The Pharaoh of hurt feelings. You can't serve God. You can't be faithful to God under these Pharaohs. You have to be set free. There's a Pharaoh of bitterness. A Pharaoh of anxiety. A Pharaoh of a critical spirit. A Pharaoh of a fault-finding spirit. A Pharaoh of unforgiveness. These Pharaohs will suffocate you spiritually. They will define your life. Our lives are to be defined by the fact I'm saved and I'm going to worship and serve God. We were not saved so that our lives could be defined by some Pharaoh. But Pharaohs will do just that. They will define your life. They will render you unable to worship and serve the one who saved your soul. These Pharaohs, they will set up prison camps. And they will interfere. And they will disrupt what we, the saved, are to do. Worshiping and serving God with our lives. These Pharaohs will keep us from ascending to greater spiritual heights. Oh, you may have a few moments where it feels like you're starting to make some spiritual progress, but guess what? Pharaoh reminds you, I'm in charge here. And you can't ascend. You're stuck. That might be the best word to describe God's people. Stuck. Stuck. These pharaohs will grip and squeeze our hearts, our minds, and our wills, rendering us unable to worship and serve the one who saved our soul. These pharaohs will fill our lives with defeat. They'll fill your life with turmoil. They'll cause you to waste your life. They'll cause great weariness. They will bring great frustration into your lives. They will bring discouragement, disorder, confusion, restlessness, joylessness. And sadly, as in the case of Israelites, this continues from one generation to another. 10 generations of bondage. That's all they knew. That's all they knew. And what is truly sad is that many who are saved enlist in Pharaoh's service. It's not just that they were taken captive. They enlist. They volunteer. And more often than not, it doesn't stop with them. The next generation enlists too. Pharaoh is intent on holding God's people in bondage, whatever the Pharaoh is. Again and again, Moses and Aaron were instructed by God. You go and say to Pharaoh. The lesson there is you must face Pharaoh. We all have them. You've got to face Pharaoh. Not only do you have to face Pharaoh, you have to confront Pharaoh. And you're to do so. Again, you go into Pharaoh and you say, "Thus saith the Lord." You are to do so with the power and authority of God. You go into Pharaoh, he told Moses and Aaron. We must know who Pharaoh is in our life. Don't misidentify the Pharaohs in our lives. The truth is, most never identify the Pharaohs in their lives. They don't even realize what it is they need to be freed from. We must identify our Pharaohs. And again, many misidentify the Pharaohs that define their lives. But once Pharaoh is identified, Pharaoh must be confronted in the power of the Lord. Whatever Pharaoh it is that holds us and keeps us back from living a functional relationship with the Lord, and that hinders us from a life of worship and service, that Pharaoh needs to be identified. And that requires something that most don't have. Honesty. It requires that you be honest. It requires that you really take a good look at yourself. And most aren't going to do that. And they will live the rest of their lives under Pharaoh. And chances are the kids will too. And their grandkids. And on it goes. The very fact that Pharaoh resisted every step of the way shows the importance of a life of worship and service. They were to just say to Pharaoh, let my people go, that we may hold a feast unto God, or that we may worship God, or that we may serve God. Pharaoh was opposed to that. He still is. But in our text, we see Moses and Aaron facing their slave master. And by the authority and the power of God, let my people go. That they. What we have to realize, regardless of the Pharaoh, regardless of how long we've been in bondage, regardless of how many generations have been affected, God is greater than any Pharaoh. God is greater than any Pharaoh. We have been set free to be free, to live for Him. We have not been set free to live in bondage. We have been set free to be free, to live for Him. Oh, may we continue to be free, to worship and to serve God. It's a horrible thing for a child of God to be in bondage, because the whole purpose of their life is unfulfilled. It's a waste. It's a waste. It's all vain. It's empty. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us some verse of song.